Trickle-down economics is back in the news, oddly enough, now that Donald Trump has, brought on board some actual Republican con men and women advisors to start selling the big lie again that they've been promoting since the late 70s. And the big lie is very straightforward. It's that somehow being more libertarian, being more Republican, being more so-called conservative, which basically means letting the billionaires run everything and getting the voice of we the people out of the way. How dare those pesky citizens want their air to be clean or their water to be pure? We can't have that. Just it's got to go. Back in 2003, Mehrun Etabari, this is over at faireconomy.org, and it's titled Trickle-Down Economics, 4 Reasons Why It Just Doesn't Work. Went all the way back to 1954, and which was a good year. I mean, he could have gone back earlier than that. He would have gotten better numbers because the first years after the war were pretty damn good. But he wanted to get, sort of a reasonable baseline from 1954 to 2003. So, a 50-year period, more or less, or a 40-year period, excuse me. And what he writes is the past 40 years have seen a gradual decrease in the top bracket's income tax rate from 91% in 63 to 35% in 2003. It went as low as 2008 in 88 and 98. So they say that it's going to do 4 things. They say that, and this is what the right-wing think tanks say. They say that cutting the top rate will lead to economic growth. They say that cutting the top rate will lead to wage growth. And they say that cutting the top rate will lead to job creation. And so he actually looked at the numbers. And first of all, the GDP growth rate. It turns out that 2 of the 3 years with the highest growth during the 1950s were when the top tax were during the 1950s, when the top tax rate was 91%. Overall, there seems to be no close relationship between the top tax rate and GDP growth rate. The correlation and coefficient between the 2 variables is 0.03. In other words, there's functionally no connection. You can't show that GDP growth goes either up or down based on the top tax rate. Now, we're talking the top tax rate, what rich people pay in taxes. Okay? It does not lead to income growth. He said it's true that with the worst year for median income decrease was 1974, 3.3%, and the top tax rate was 70%. However, it was also 70% the year with the highest median growth increase, 4.7% in 72, the year before, or 2 years before. Once again, the lack of connection. The correlation coefficient was below 0, 0.06 to be exact. In other words, income has gone up slightly more in years with higher taxes, but so slightly that you can't even say that raising taxes increases working people's income. So what about wage growth? Wages grew at a level of at least 1%, usually much more, all throughout the period when the top tax rate was 91%. So while the top tax rate was 91%, we had solid wage growth. However, if we look at the 19 years of the study period when the top tax rate was 50% or less, we see that 8 of those 19 years saw an increase in wages of less than 1%. Thus, it seems that hourly wages grew more when taxes were higher on rich people. Now, this just makes perfect sense, right? If rich people can't take their money in taxes, then it's going to stay in the company. And if it's staying in the company, it might be used for better wages, right? He says hourly wages grew more when taxes were higher. Indeed, the correlation coefficient is 0.034, indicating a mild positive relationship between higher taxes for the rich and higher hourly wages for working people. This finding flies in the face of the conservative theory. Yeah, how about that? And number 4, cutting the top tax rate does not lead to job creation. He said the unemployment rate laid across the top tax rate from 1954 to 2002. 3 of the 4 largest decreases in unemployment occurred in years when the top tax rate was 91%. In other words, 3 of our best years, top tax rate was 91%. The correlation coefficient here is 0.11, meaning that there have been slightly more jobs created in years with lower top tax rates, but the pattern is negligible, nowhere near strong enough to justify or signify a relationship. In other words, the whole theory is fantasy, and 40 years of actual science/math proves that the whole theory is fantasy. The whole theory of lower taxes, less government, less regulation. So what do they actually mean when they talk about, lower taxes, less government, lower regulation? What they mean is lower taxes on the very, very rich. Now, we did that 40 years ago, and what has happened is that the rich, the wealth has exploded at the top 1%, and it's collapsed at the bottom, to the point where we've got this new study. This is from the International Business Times, reporting on reports that were both in USA Today and The Guardian about a new study, 2 reports, and a new study came out. The reports are titled "Bringing Teens to the Table and Impossible Choices," and they were conducted by the Feeding America and Libre Institute. They found that 1 in 5 children under the age of 18, 1 in 5, live in a household with limited or uncertain access to food. The Libre Institute described girls selling their bodies or sex for money as a way to survive, whereas boys who were desperate for food resorted to shoplifting and selling drugs. Susan Popkin, a senior fellow at the Libre Institute, lead author of the report, says kids knew all the strategies: hanging around your friend's house to see if they'll feed you, going hungry so your younger brothers and sisters can eat, saving your school lunch so you can eat it at night so you could sleep at night. Many of the teens in the communities observed spoke about transactional dating, which means a teenager regularly sees and has sex with someone, often a significantly older man, in exchange for meals, material goods, or cash. So, they're saying we should have policies so that these kids no longer have to turn to crime to survive. Gee, you think? How about raising the top tax rate back to where it was so that we had job growth? Except really there's not that big a correlation. So it's not the taxes. Regulation is, pretty straightforward stuff. It's a question: do you want to go back to the Cuyahoga River being on fire? Do you want to go back to Lake Erie being dead? Do you want to go back to water and air that is so polluted that, high percentages of people are getting cancer and asthma and dying and things like that? And of course, whenever anybody says small business, you just please smile. I mean, you just have to understand. Small business. I've been running small businesses my whole entire life, literally since I was 17 years old. I have been running small businesses. And small businesses, and only 2 of those businesses were set up as C corporations, as regular corporations. The vast majority of small businesses are set up as sub-S corporations or LLCs or variations on that, where basically you pay income taxes based on your own personal income tax rate. And you just pass the company's income becomes part of your personal income tax return. And it's so, most small businesses don't pay the business tax rate. They pay the personal tax rate. And most small businesses, 97% of all small businesses in America, pay virtually no income taxes. It's not that hard to do. First of all, most small businesses are not all that profitable. And secondly, there's ways to just kind of move the money around. But don't tell that to the Koch brothers, and don't tell that to NPR. This morning on NPR, they had a guest, Daniel Garza, who was with the Libre Institute, and he is a front man for basically the Koch brothers. And in fact, here's what Daniel Garza had to say on NPR about this outreach that these libertarians, these right-wingers, are doing to the Hispanic community. Here he is.
A group linked with the billionaire Koch brothers. It's called the Libre Initiative. Libre is Spanish for free, and the group is dedicated to spreading free market ideology to Latino voters who have voted for Democrats overwhelmingly in recent years. Daniel Garza, the group's leader, says it's involved in Senate races such as Nevada and Florida, but not involved in the presidential race.
We have not been involved in the presidential race because we feel that there's just a lack of enthusiasm for both candidates. We don't feel that either one is strong on the direction that they're taking with respect to reining in irresponsible spending.
Wait a second. Hang on just a second. First of all, if you're pushing Republican candidates anywhere in the country, you're helping Donald Trump. Because if you can convince somebody in Wisconsin to go into a voting booth and vote against Russ Feingold, vote for the Republican, Ron Johnson, that person is going to vote for Donald Trump while they're there, right? So all of these efforts actually are supporting Trump, number one. And number two, you're not sure that either Trump or Clinton want to restrain spending. What does restrain spending mean? Restrain spending means forget about working people and poor people. This is code. There's a bunch of code words here, and you need to know them. Restrain spending means cutting off funds for working people and poor people. Block grant this stuff to the states and let them just chop it up. He continues.
Reducing the tax burden on people, reducing the
Hang on just a second. Reduce the tax burden on people. It's not, for average working people, if taxes go up, wages go up. If taxes go down, wages can actually go down. And we saw some piece of that in the 1980s, although the taxes on average working people actually didn't go down. Only 1 year did they go down. But by and large, they don't go down. But the fact of the matter is employers know what people make after taxes. And if they know that, their after-tax income is going to go up because they got a tax cut, they're going to cut their wages. If they know that their after-tax income is going to go down because of a tax increase, they're going to have to raise their wages if they want to keep those people. So again, nonsense. This is nonsense. He continues.
Burden who are going to effectively address the issue of
the regulatory burden. The regulatory burden is a terrible thing for Georgia Pacific. Being on the stuff that they pump into our water and air as they make paper, or Koch Industries and their stuff going into the air. He continues.
Obamacare.
Yeah. He's going to go after Obamacare, right? How dare
burden
people
on
have
people,
health
reducing
care.
the regulatory burden who are going to effectively address the issue of Obamacare.
Yep, there you go. We can continue.
Advanced school choice. Yeah.
Advanced school choice. In other words, we're going to destroy public education. No money to colleges at all. And, with private school, or with public schools are the libertarians and the Kochs refer to them as state schools, government schools, and say basically they shouldn't exist. He continues.
You have Joe Heck, who would reduce the tax burden, the regulatory burden, who would support a balanced budget amendment.
Right. This is the Republican in Nevada. A balanced budget amendment like Andrew Jackson did back in the 1830s that threw us into the worst depression in the history of the United States. He continues.
Who is supportive of school choice?
Daniel Garza of the Libre Initiative.
Yeah, and then at the very end, they never once called him on the BS that he was putting forward. None of this stuff adds up. Now, back in the 80s, when Reagan was first pitching this stuff, we were actually having conversations about, is it possible that supply-side economics works? That if you give more money to rich people, it's actually going to make the country wealthier? There was an actual discussion of that. Most people alive today have they're too young to even remember that discussion. We'll be back. So let's revisit this rabbit hole that we've slid down into here once again. This morning on Joe Scarborough's program, he had Larry Kudlow on. Larry Kudlow has been a guest on this program many times over the years, although increasingly these conservatives are, frankly, refusing to come on this program and debate me. I can't, we'll reach out to Larry Kudlow and see if he shows up. But he's got a new book out that is saying that if you liked John Kennedy, you'll love Ronald Reagan. That all Ronald Reagan did was continue John Kennedy's policies. That Ronald Reagan's tax cuts and supply-side economics, that was all Kennedy's idea. In fact, he said it right on TV this morning. He said, if you want to criticize it, fine, but you keep in mind, you're criticizing not just Reagan, you're criticizing Kennedy. This is the new conservative/Republican shtick of trying to say to Democrats, we're not crazy. We're just like John Kennedy. Which is a lie. Richard Nixon tried this in 1960 because John Kennedy, who himself was, from a family that in today's dollars is probably worth $1 billion or more, certainly was multimillionaire. He was born a multimillionaire, Jack Kennedy. He knew how the game worked. He knew that people in his tax bracket didn't pay income taxes because there was a million loopholes. And so he suggested, let's close those loopholes for people at the top. Let's close those loopholes for business too, by the way, the business deductions and depreciation and entertainment expenses and things like that. Let's close those loopholes. We can lower the tax rate down to 70%, 74%. if we close those loopholes, and we'll actually get more money from rich people. In other words, it was not a tax cut that Nixon was proposing. It was a tax increase. And here he is speaking with Richard Nixon, talking back to Richard Nixon about not only how he's going to get more income, more revenue, but how he's going to spend it. Here he is.
I think it's possible to gain a $700 million to $1 billion through tax changes, which I believe would close up loopholes on dividend withholding, on expense accounts. So in my judgment, we would spend more money in this administration on aid to education. We'd spend more money on housing. We'd spend more money, and I hope more wisely, on defense than this administration has done. Mr. Nixon misstates my figures constantly, which is, of course, is right. But the fact of the matter is, here is where I stand, and I just want to have it on the public record.
And Larry Kudlow and Joe Scarborough and the entire American media. I mean, the Republicans constantly come on and they say these, oh, yeah, Jack Kennedy was the one who wanted to cut the taxes on rich people. No, Jack Kennedy wanted to raise taxes on rich people. He just wanted to do it in a way that he felt, could succeed legislatively. And it did, by the way. This was done in '64. Lyndon Johnson did it. Kennedy was dead. LBJ passed that tax cut, and it raised revenues from rich people. It was a tax increase. But the propaganda machine, nobody on MSNBC, nobody on NPR is pushing back against these guys. They're just letting the lies lay out there.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And so I've got to do my job and tell you what's really going on. It's just bizarre that I would even have to. It's bizarre.